This month marks the release of Halloween Kills, the 12th installment in the long-running slasher franchise, and although the Danny McBride written sequel appears to be an original screenplay, you might be surprised to learn that some of the plot ideas to come out of the latest movie had actually been conceptualized more than 30 years ago, when producer Mustafa Akkad was still optioning several different scripts in order to make Halloween 4. So today, we're going to be taking a look at one of those abandoned versions of the 1988 movie, where if you stick around to the end of this video, you'll find out exactly which story elements were eventually reused in 2021's Halloween Kills. What is up, Scream Team? Zach Cherry here, and if you're as obsessed with horror movies as I am, you might want to consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on those bell notifications, setting them to all. That way, you can stay up to date with all my latest content. In this video, we'll be going over the final rejected sequel idea for Halloween 4 that featured Michael Myers having a psychic connection with Laurie Strode's daughter. Nope, not that one, and not that one either. That's right, predating Jamie, Karen, and even Josh Hartnett, there was once a fourth Strode child who would go toe-to-toe with her evil Uncle Michael, long before the rest of her Halloween multiverse siblings ever arrived on the scene. And despite this script bearing a striking resemblance to the eventually produced Return of Michael Myers, this movie would have seen a dramatically different second and third act, including 4 specific plot details that, while ultimately being removed, would go on to be referenced in Halloween Kills. Just as a footnote, all of the information in this video has been sourced from the book Taking Shape 2, which is a very in-depth look into the rejected sequel scripts of the Halloween franchise. So just for shits and gigs, toss this video a thumbs up and meet me in the comments down below to let me know what you think of the Halloween 4 that never was. Let's get into it. Initially, the premise of Halloween 4 had been created by a trio of writers who were all still credited with the story, along with Alan B. McElroy, who wrote the final script. This team would consist of Danny Lipsius, Larry Ratner, and Benjamin Ruffner. Similar to the character of Stephanie Jameson, Laurie's original daughter who had appeared in the Michael Takes Chicago script, this trio of writers concocted a story that also featured Michael's niece in a prominent role. And with Jamie Lee Curtis prematurely retiring from the horror genre, thus opting not to return to play Laurie Strode for the unforeseeable future, they would have to work around this by writing the young girl to have been recently orphaned. This idea was then paired with the premise of a reinstitutionalized Michael breaking free in order to return to Haddonfield in his pursuit of killing off the last of his bloodline. The specifics of the submission by the trio of writers are unknown. However, Larry Ratner asserts that the film's surprise ending, in which Michael's niece violently attacks a relative, had originally hailed from their material. For whatever reason, their draft wasn't satisfying enough for producers, as Alan B. McElroy would later be hired to revise their story into his own script. But prior to this, another writer, Shem Bitterman, was brought in to submit his own original idea. If that name sounds familiar to you, that's because Bitterman eventually returned as a credited writer on Halloween 5, and as you'll probably notice as we go along, much of his unused material here not only appears in Halloween Kills, but would also make its way over to the much maligned yet delightfully campy 1989 sequel, The Revenge of Michael Myers. In that regard, it's always been pretty standard practice for this franchise to repurpose story elements that were featured in abandoned scripts. After all, the producers did invest money by purchasing these stories, so obviously there were aspects to them that they really liked. This was already evident with the Michael Takes Chicago story, which was heavily repurposed to become Halloween H2O, with notable inclusions such as the death scene involving a hand being shoved into a garbage disposal unit. For the sake of anyone who hasn't seen Halloween Kills yet, I won't call specific attention to the repurposed material in my initial read-through. However, I'll make sure to give sufficient spoiler warning before I delve into the comparisons later on, which again, make sure you're sticking around until the end of the video to see. Like the eventual Halloween 4, as well as every other sequel as of 2021, with the exception of Halloween's 3 and H2O, Bitterman's story once again gives Michael home field advantage by setting it in Haddonfield, Illinois. And just as the previous script submissions had done, the events would also unfold on Halloween night 1988, 10 years after the original. Since Jamie Lee Curtis was vehemently opposed to making more Halloween movies, Mustafa Akkad was weary of purchasing any more scripts that featured characters whose portrayers would not be willing to reprise their roles, as he had already lost money by investing in the Michael Takes Chicago script, which would have featured Laurie Strode front front and center. Still wanting to bridge the gap between Halloween's 2 and 4, however, Akkad wanted to make sure he could at least secure Donald Pleasence, and so an early offer was put out to the actor, which he accepted after receiving John Carpenter's blessing. Henceforth, Dr. Loomis would feature prominently in all future submissions, including this one. Besides Michael Myers himself, of course, the only other returning character would be Sheriff Leigh Brackett, who had also been heavily featured in the first draft of the Dennis Etchison script back when John Carpenter was still involved in Halloween 4's production. However, it was never made clear as to why he was written out of the second draft, nor is it clear why his role here eventually morphed into Sheriff Ben Meeker, as we find out in the eventual movie that Brackett had retired and moved away from Haddonfield. Perhaps Charles Cyphers didn't want to return, or he was just too loyal to John Carpenter, having already been a major reoccurring figure in the director's film repertoire. Either way, the character's involvement would bring old wounds to the surface, as we would have revisited the tense dynamic between him and Loomis that never got its proper dues in Halloween 2. In terms of its new characters, the only two of relative importance here are Laurie's orphaned daughter, 6-year-old Amanda Hatch, and her 17-year-old foster sister, Linda. Obviously, these two act as early precursors to both Jamie Lloyd and Rachel Carruthers, but with some major differences, as we'll go on to see. The biggest divergence here, besides Amanda being 2 years younger than Jamie Lloyd, is the fact that Linda, too, is an adoptee. This would have given the character a much stronger resonance, as Linda would have been able to better understand her foster sister's familial yearning, as she too would have either lost or been abandoned by her biological parents. In that regard, the notion of two orphans banding together to survive and defeat a psychotic serial killer is very similar to the relationship of Andy and Kyle that we would eventually see several years later in Child's Play 2. Our story begins with a flashback to the end of Halloween 2, where we would witness Dr. Loomis screaming at the firefighters to let it burn while they attempted to put out the flames engulfing Haddonfield Memorial Hospital. After the 1978 flashback, we then jump ahead 10 years to Smith's Grove Sanitarium, where we follow a group of interns who are being led around on a tour of the facility by the head physician, who would eventually go on to be Dr. Hoffman. During the tour, he gives short backstories on all the dangerous patients, eventually coming to a comatose Michael Myers, who's being housed in an entire unit to himself, separate from the rest of the facility. It's here where we're reintroduced to a now visibly scarred Dr. Loomis, who joins in on the tour to regale the interns with his own rendition of the legend of Michael Myers.
My memory goes back 12 years.
While expositing the 10-year gap, he accidentally lets slip that Laurie Strode was killed in a car accident, leaving behind a 6-year-old daughter who still lives in Haddonfield. Similar to the movie, the implication here is that Michael is only pretending to be in a coma and twitches at the mere mention of another living relative. Of course, nobody takes notice of this, and the tour moves along as normal. Later that night, after most of the facility clears out, Michael makes his escape by killing 2 romantically involved nurses and uses their keys to exit the institution. Now, while the basis for this opening is fundamentally the same as what we saw in the movie, there are some major differences. Firstly, Dr. Loomis appears much earlier in this draft and is somewhat responsible for Michael's escape, as he foolishly reveals the information about Laurie's daughter within earshot of his patient. This opening scene also doesn't involve the transferring of Michael to another facility, which as of 2018 has become a running cliche, having been the reason for his escape in a total of 4 Halloween films. 3 if you're going by director's cut canon for the 2007 remake. In any event, this next bit would have been a first and only for the franchise, as Michael makes his way out to the highway, and rather than killing a motorist and GTAing their vehicle, he literally waits for passing cars to hitchhike with. This is where we meet the character who would eventually become Reverend Sayer, only in this version, he's called Zachariah and is traveling with his dog. He mistakes the hitchhiking Michael as an apparition of divinity and stops to let him into his truck, only to see that Michael won't reciprocate any conversation. After awkwardly sitting in silence for a bit, the Reverend turns on the radio and begins singing along to it, which begins to annoy Michael, inciting him to smash it. He then fully snaps the man's neck, killing him, and also murders the dog, for good measure. Michael, that's a dick move, man. It should be noted here that when Michael escapes from Smith's Grove, he doesn't have any bandages like we see in the final film, and further to that, it's never revealed where or when he gets the mask, as he just shows up in town with it the next day. Also, just like the other 2 scripts before this one, Michael has a complete change of wardrobe. Rather than wearing the mechanic's coveralls, he steals Reverend Zachariah's outfit instead and walks around Haddonfield dressed like a priest with a white mask on for the entirety of the movie. This all just goes to show how the perceived rules of the franchise were not yet in place, since every script detailed so far tried to give Michael a new look. After killing Zachariah and his dog, Michael continues to drive his truck towards Haddonfield, where we would have gotten a POV shot from the killer as he drives along the highway road. In another rare moment for the Halloween franchise, we would have been given a glimpse into Michael's psyche, as his perspective would have yielded a distorted vision of the hell he experiences on a daily basis, with the night road ablaze in giant flames, while the screams of his past victims can be heard in the distance.
Totally. Hey, jerk!
Michael's POV then transitions into a nightmare that's being had by his 6-year-old niece, Amanda Hatch, establishing that the two characters share a psychic bond. As I mentioned before, a lot of Shem Bitterman's rejected content from this screenplay had been recycled by him when he wrote the first draft of Halloween 5, with the telepathic connection probably being the most notable holdover. For the sake of this script, however, Amanda has fortunately not been rendered mute. On the surface, Amanda appears very similar to Jamie Lloyd, as they're close enough in age and share a similar predicament, but it's in the psychology of the character where we start to notice many major differences. For instance, in The Return of Michael Myers, Jamie Lloyd has a very loving relationship with the Carruthers, whereas this script's Amanda outright rejects her foster parents and appears to have a very contentious relationship with them, which only further imbues her with a sense of familial longing for a biological relative. As we find out, Amanda is very well aware of the fact that she has a serial killer for an uncle who's been locked away, and yet she displays a warped perception of him as she doesn't fully understand the extent of his evil and believes he's been unfairly characterized by the residents of Haddonfield as the boogeyman. In any event, Amanda does get along well with her foster sister Linda, who we're introduced to when she comforts her after waking up from the nightmare. The next morning, Amanda walks by the Myers house on her way to school, a location which is prominently featured in this story, unlike the eventual movie where the house was noticeably absent. On this particular day of Halloween, Amanda notices that the door to the house has been left open and decides to go inside. However, while the Myers house was last seen in a dilapidated state in 1978, the property has since been cleaned up and gutted, where it's revealed that the new owners, who are described as a yuppie couple, are in the process of renovating the interior. The couple are shown to be very kind and welcoming to Amanda, although she doesn't stick around too long as she's already running late for school. It's here where we get a similar scene to Jamie getting bullied by her classmates for being the niece of Michael Myers, only Amanda reacts instead by defending her uncle and declaring that the boogeyman can be friendly too. He's not, and unbeknownst to Amanda, Michael has already arrived in town earlier that morning and has begun stalking her from afar. Back at Smith's Grove, hospital staff find the bodies of the nurses and realize Michael is missing, which sets Loomis off on his crusade to find the killer. And although he's forbidden by hospital administration from getting involved, he ends up stealing an unmarked police car, which he uses to speed towards Haddonfield. There is an additional scene which probably would have been the precursor to the standoff in the diner, although it doesn't involve Loomis having a confrontation with Michael, and instead sees him ditching the cop car along the highway for a new set of wheels. Setting his sights on a pickup truck parked outside of a farm, Loomis steals that automobile too, which almost gets him shot in the process when the owner comes out chasing after him with a shotgun. In any event, this only further demonstrates that the mad psychiatrist is still prone to operating above the law, as he'll do any and everything necessary in order to stop Michael from killing again. Upon his arrival in town, he promptly goes to the police station where he's reunited with a nonplussed Sheriff Brackett, who on one hand still blames Loomis for Annie's death, but on the other is willing to work with him because he knows that Loomis understands the situation better than anyone else. Later that night, Linda takes Amanda trick-or-treating, where the young girl runs off after seeing Michael, who lures her back to his childhood home. Once inside, she fails to take notice of the murdered bodies of the new owners and instead proceeds to run around the house playing hide and seek, first with Michael and then with Linda, who eventually comes to the house looking for her. Linda is attacked by Michael only to escape to the basement, where she finds Amanda hiding and is also horrified to discover the disinterred corpse of Judith Myers, which rests beneath her once again stolen headset. headstone. It's here where Amanda unearths the clown costume Michael wore when he murdered Judith in '63, which has somehow inexplicably been buried underneath the house for the past 25 years, rather than being inside of an evidence locker. This would be how Michael's niece procures the outfit in this iteration, as opposed to purchasing a brand new replica at Vincent's drugstore, as we see in the movie. After adorning the costume, Amanda continues to remain oblivious to the threat her uncle poses, but goes along with her foster sister anyway, where the two escape the basement through a cellar door. At this point, they go to the police station where they find Loomis and Brackett, with the former realizing that Michael's intention is to kill off his entire bloodline, which causes him to launch into a soliloquy about how the Shape needs to free himself from the shackles of his own humanity. Loomis and Brackett attempt to devise a plan to stop Michael, however, Loomis is more concerned with recapturing his patient, while Brackett's main concern is Amanda's safety, even rejecting the doctor's idea to use the girl as bait. Again, this would be another Shem Bitterman idea, which, while not used here, would eventually resurface in the climax of Halloween 5. Due to Loomis's apathy towards her, however, Amanda is not only pushed to further sympathize with her uncle, but also now views Dr. Loomis as a bad man and the real villain of the story. And while everything up to this point has been mostly similar to the shooting script, this is where the two stories will diverge the most. If you'll recall in the movie, Loomis instigates a vigilante mob to go after Myers, followed by all of the characters coalescing at Sheriff Meeker's house, where they're joined by one of his deputies, who has unwittingly given Michael a ride to the hideout. Conversely, in this version, Sheriff Brackett appoints 3 of his deputies, Tom, Jim, and Ben, to escort Amanda and Linda to his isolated hunting cabin on the outskirts of town, while he and Loomis stay behind, combing the streets of Haddonfield in hopes of finding Michael out and about. One of the deputies, Jim, calls his girlfriend Tammy over CB radio, where, frustrated that their date has been interrupted by official police business, invites her to join them at the cabin. Overhearing this broadcast, Michael stows away in the backseat of Tammy's car, which she then gets in to follow the rest of the deputies, giving Michael a free ride to his target. Once they all arrive, Deputy Jim, who's been assigned lookout duty, wanders off with Tammy instead, where the two fool around on the outskirts of the property. It's here where Michael sneaks up and dispatches of both of them by way of double impaling the couple to a tree. He then makes his way to the cabin's generator, where he cuts the power and quietly kills Deputy Tom, leaving just Deputy Ben and the 2 girls remaining. It should be noted that the character of Deputy Ben, who is the youngest of the 3 officers, somewhat acts as a proxy to Brady, as he does embody that character's lesser-seen valiant qualities. In fact, there is a well-established flirtation between the 17-year-old Linda and the just-out-of-high-school rookie officer, which does appear to have eventually been echoed with Rachel and Brady. For the sake of streamlining the story, this surplus of characters would go on to be condensed for the movie, which means that both Deputy Jim and Deputy Ben were molded together into the slightly younger high school-aged Brady, who would then engage in a tryst with Tammy, who would also go on to become Kelly Meeker. In any event, Deputy Ben meets a similar fate as Brady, as he's killed while protecting the girls, much to the horror of his pseudo-love interest Linda. Back in town, we get a callback to the Ben Tramer incident from Halloween 2, when Loomis and Brackett mistake a drunk man in a mask for Michael and chase him down, almost killing him. This was rewritten in Bitterman's second draft to be a group of teenaged pranksters instead, which was material that had originally appeared in the Dennis Etchison script, where Michael hid amongst a group of imposters, all wearing the same mask. As we know from the finished film, McElroy would implement both ideas of the vigilante mob mistaking a drunk Ted Hollister for Michael, as well as the scene with the teenaged pranksters, but excluded one key difference, which deals heavily with the ultimate fate of Sheriff Brackett. Believing one of the masked pranksters to be the man who killed his daughter back in 1978, Brackett begins to chase after him, which causes him to suffer a major heart attack. He's subsequently brought to Haddonfield Memorial Hospital, at which point he dies in the emergency room, with Dr. Loomis vowing to kill Michael out of revenge. At this point in the story, Loomis races towards the cabin, where Amanda has finally come to her senses about Michael, after she witnesses him knock Linda unconscious, prompting the young girl to renounce the boogeyman as her uncle. She then tries to wake Linda up by telling her to come alive.
Please come alive. Don't be dead. You can't be dead.
It's here where Michael grabs Amanda and forces her to recreate his final memory of Judith by sitting in front of a vanity mirror and brushing her hair. I can see why this was eventually scrapped, as I can imagine how awkward it would have looked for Michael to pick up a brush and mime the action of running it through his hair in an instructional manner. However, a lot of this does again feel like it made its way into the Halloween 5 climax. Either way, Amanda refuses to acquiesce to Michael's twisted demands, but before he can become forceful with her, Linda regains consciousness. In an attempt to buy time so her foster sister can escape, Linda plays into Michael's game by brushing her own hair and calling Michael by name while unbuttoning her blouse. If this sounds familiar to you, it's probably because this moment is very evocative of Friday the 13th Part 2's finale, where final girl Ginny uses a similar psychology as a defense against Jason by pretending to be his mother in order to get him to lower his guard. Michael slowly approaches Linda with a knife, but as he goes to raise the blade before slashing it down on her, she sneakily stabs him in the throat with a concealed pair of scissors. This, of course, would be yet another Halloween 5 holdover, as Rachel's original demise would have seen Michael stab her in the throat with a pair of scissors before actress Ellie Cornell insisted she be stabbed in the chest instead, as it was a more dignified send-off for the character. At the very moment that Michael is stabbed, Loomis suddenly bursts through the doors of the cabin and shoots him several times until the killer finally collapses to the floor. With Michael seemingly dead, the story ends with his body being loaded into a coroner's van while the authorities refuse to let Amanda see the body. She finds a way to sneak around them anyway, where she sits alone with the corpse and removes his mask, revealing the face of a young boy underneath. As she goes to kiss his cheek, he wakes up and begins violently strangling her, only for the story to psych us out by revealing it to all be just a dream. As Amanda wakes up in bed the next morning, she goes to look out the window and notices that Michael is now standing in the backyard looking up at her before disappearing before her very eyes. In an alternate ending, also written by Bitterman, Loomis instead shows up at the cabin with a bunch of empty syringes from the hospital, which he injects into Michael, causing death by multiple embolisms. Before Michael dies, he grabs Loomis's arm and forces him to stick himself with the last syringe, causing both of them to collapse and die on the cabin floor. The rest of the scene plays out the same, with Amanda unmasking Michael, but there is no strangulation and there is no dream, with Michael instead opening his eyes after he's already been taken away. Both endings leave a lot of questions, such as how has Michael reverted back to his childlike appearance? This is an anomaly we would see again in the Friday the 13th franchise when Jason takes Manhattan, and although it could be explained away in Bitterman's first draft as being part of Amanda's dream, that still begs the question, at what point in the story did the dream begin or end, as this really starts to blur the lines of reality, since for all we know, the entire story could have just taken place inside the imagination of a 6-year-old girl. Bitterman's script was well liked enough by the producers, but when Dwight Little was hired to direct, he brought Alan B. McElroy on board with him, who he had personally recommended for script revision duties. Unfortunately for Bitterman, the Writers Guild deemed that not enough of his material was used in the final creation of the screenplay, so he was never properly credited, and thus unable to benefit from receiving any future royalties. McElroy would go on to combine elements of both the Bitterman script and the draft submitted by Lipsius, Ratner, and Ruffner, ultimately yielding a much more streamlined story. Now, if you've already seen Halloween Kills and have been watching up until this point, you might have recognized a few things in this script that were referenced in that movie. So just a huge spoiler alert for anybody who has not yet seen Halloween Kills, this is where we're going to compare the content that was repurposed in the 2021 film. Obviously, a major aspect of Halloween Kills that was carried over from the return of Michael Myers is the vigilante mob, which, although was featured in the final screenplay by Alan B. McElroy, did not actually appear in the Shem Bitterman story. However, there are at least 4 notable references to his abandoned script. Number 1. The story begins with a flashback to the end of Halloween 2, where there would have been additional content filmed that featured Loomis protesting against the on-scene firefighters from extinguishing the blazing Haddonfield Memorial Hospital. Knowing full well that Michael's body still lay inside burning, he cries out for them to let it burn. This is the exact quote in a similar scenario that was seen at the beginning of Halloween Kills, where after trapping Michael inside the burning death trap that was once her home, Laurie is driven to the hospital on the back of a pickup truck with a mortal stab wound. While en route, she passes by the fire trucks responding to the blaze, screaming the same phrase, "let it burn," similarly referring to the shape, which Loomis had always considered to be an it rather than a he or him. Number 2. Not only does this story feature Michael's childhood home, but also describes the property as being renovated and transformed into a fully livable house by the couple who have recently purchased it. And while this does evoke memories of the Strode family moving into the fixer-upper as seen in 1995's The Curse of Michael Myers, the subplot is much more closely aligned with the gay couple in Halloween Kills who take up residency at 45 Lampkin Lane. As we see in the movie, both Big John and Little John have moved into and fully renovated the once dilapidated house, only to have Michael return home and murder them both. Their bodies are later discovered by Allison, who shows up at the house searching for Michael in a similar fashion to Linda, who arrives looking for Amanda, only to find that Michael has killed the current owners as well. Number 3. The story features the return of Sheriff Leigh Brackett, who is still haunted by the death of his daughter Annie in 1978. In a tragic twist, Brackett suffers a heart attack and dies while trying to get revenge, which is a similar fate he suffers by the climax of 2021's Halloween Kills. After being absent from the franchise for the last 40 years, Charles Cyphers returns to the role, where he's now employed as a security guard at Haddonfield Memorial Hospital, which is a position that doesn't have the best track record when it comes to surviving Michael Myers. Rather than getting offed while investigating a strange disturbance in the storage locker, however, he becomes part of the Evil Dies Tonight mob and appears to finally get his revenge for Annie's death. Of course, Michael Myers is no punk, and as Brackett attempts to finish the job, Michael jumps up and slashes the former Haddonfield sheriff's throat, giving him an equally grim demise. Number 4. The end of the screenplay features Laurie's daughter Amanda unmasking Michael and seeing his face appear as it did when he was a little boy. This is obviously a very confusing revelation, as it appears in both the dream and non-dream ending, and while the supernatural aspects of the Halloween franchise have ranged from ambiguous to full-on blatant, it should be noted that they have always existed in every single movie, including Halloween Kills, where we get a much more subdued version of this ending. The film's climax culminates in Laurie's daughter Karen unmasking Michael, who, while not dead, is drawn out into a trap where he's then seemingly killed by the Evil Dies Tonight mob. It's here where Karen returns to the Myers house, where she looks up into the second-story window and sees a vision of young Michael Myers. This causes her to go upstairs and look out the same window, where the still living Michael suddenly appears behind her and seemingly stabs her to death. Of course, unlike the abandoned Halloween 4 script, this isn't a dream, and it doesn't look like Karen will be waking up from it, so we'll have to wait until the next movie in 2022 to find out what happens. However, since so much of the Halloween franchise contains content that is sourced from its many lost sequels, perhaps the plot to Halloween Ends can be found in the pages of the remaining unmade scripts. Just want to give a big shout out and thank you to all of my patrons for their continued support. Make sure to check out more of my Halloween related content, including breakdowns of the other lost sequels of the franchise. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.